All right. On today's episode, we had Bakari Akil. Bakari founded Graves Hall Capital to acquire companies. In 2023, he purchased a $35 million burlap bag manufacturing company in collaboration with Granite Creek Partners. In this venture, he recruited the company's CEO and now holds a position on the board of directors. Additionally, in 2021, he executed the acquisition of a $25 million educational technology company alongside Iron Creek Partners. Definitely a very interesting podcast. Talked a lot about grit. Casey, what were some of your thoughts here?
Yeah, man. I have a very good story around personal development and reading and studying. I love all that good stuff, but it's always powerful to meet somebody that, got there. They ran across a concept and an idea that can change their financial lifestyle. We're not talking about going from just somebody having some money and working. We're talking about somebody that was broke, one time homeless, all of these things, to then saying, wow, leverage buyout, M&A, and then doing the work that it takes to get there. And time and time again, and we're not talking about overnight success. We're talking about almost 6 years.
Yeah, banging your head against the wall continuously.
Failure. And to be able to do that and to have the gut to do that and to be able to hand up, man, unbelievable. And then now he's traveling the world.
No, cool. So tenacity, it's all what it's all about, right? This is a good story of just M&A is hard, right? Business is hard. And most things that you want in life are not easy, right? They don't come for free. And it's a good example of just how much you have to slog through things. You do things that work, you do things that don't work. You almost have something that works and then it completely implodes. And being able to get up, like you said, I think in the story, he talks about the thing that he did a week later, he went and pushed go, right? So after a week after complete deal imploding, still a week later deciding to, hey, send out that email, and luckily did end up getting a fish. So definitely an interesting story. And like I said, we kind of talk about going from homeless to hanging out in Bali with a bunch of other friends. And so,
oh man, yeah, definitely. Got to listen to this. Outstanding. And if you've been searching for a long time, listen to this. It's a must.
Yeah. Thanks. So on today's episode, we have Bakari Akil all the way from Bali, Indonesia, currently where he's at. So Bakari, welcome to the show.
Yeah. Great to have you, Bakari.
Thank you. Awesome. You want to go ahead and hop in, man. Let's tell us a little bit more about what you're doing today and how you got into that lower mid-level market space.
Sure. So I'm the founder of Graves Hall Capital, which is a private equity firm I created to buy companies. So far, we've done a few deals, acquired a company called NYP Corp, which is a burlap bag manufacturing company. Did that deal last year in partnership with a private equity firm called Granite Creek Partners. Before that, completed an acquisition of an educational technology company in partnership with a family office called Iron Creek. And separate from that, I've worked as either director of corporate development or head of mergers and acquisitions for a few technology companies, an AI company. And also I teach the subject, entrepreneurship through acquisition, or just teaching the MBA candidates how to buy companies at Cornell's business school, and formerly was a lecturer at Columbia Business School. And so I've been an acquirer as a person, as an acquirer on, representing corporations, and also teaching the subject for people who are interested in doing it themselves. And so that said, my background and the way I got into the space is pretty unconventional. When I was 25, I was trying to figure out, right now I'm 34, but at the time when I was 25, I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do with my life and most importantly, how I was going to get rich. Like that was like
most 25-year-old dude was trying to decide both those things.
I was very poor at that time, but I was just like very committed to this idea that I needed to break out of poverty. And I felt like, for me, it was most important that it seemed like there was a middle-class trap. And it was very easy to get caught in a middle-class existence that wouldn't get you fully out of poverty. You'd just be sort of like a paycheck away from ultimate disaster. And so I was looking into what it took and reading lots of books and, learning as much as I can, and ultimately came across the world of entrepreneurship through acquisitions and search funds, and just this concept that an individual could go out and buy an entire business on their own by putting together, capital, finding deals and just being resourceful. And if there was anything I had at that time was resourcefulness. And I think that I still hold on to those same principles from that time. And so I put my nose to the grind to try to get this accomplished. And that's how I've gotten to where I am today.
So really quick, did you grow up in an entrepreneur household?
I wouldn't say necessarily.
People typically just default to, hey, how do I go find a job that'll give me salary and kind of allow me to grow?
Exactly.
So what led you to kind of think, hey, I'm going to go find a business?
My father always felt that it was most important to be an entrepreneur. He always had little side hustles going on that were bringing in more money than whatever his job was. My mom would also have different businesses herself that she attempted, but there was no true business success in my family. My father was actually a Vietnam War veteran. He's actually been written about in books because of missions that he was involved in, like these very secretive missions that the U.S. was unwilling to even confirm existed for decades, and have just recently become declassified, and now they're finally giving acknowledgement to the group. My dad was a Green Beret, which was a part of the I don't know if you know the Green Berets.
He taught you how to be tough.
Yeah, so my dad was like,
I don't want to get punished in his household.
Yeah, thank you for understanding.
My old man was Army Ranger, so I grew up in a similar mentality, right?
Yeah. So
failure's not an option. Don't talk back.
That's right. That was military guy. And my mom had different businesses, but as I said, no true business success. So a lot of this really just came from, internally saying to myself, how do I get rich?
So Bakari, you said something to me. You said something that it kind of jumped out to me, is about that personal development, right? So you're 25, you're sitting there going, hey, how do I get rich, right? It sounds like I need to buy a business. That's that wealth ability. And, so in that process, what would you say, what was your favorite book? What was that book that was your turning point that you were just like, this is how I'm doing it?
And I would say not only was this book very influential and had a big impact on me, a big part of the beginning of my business education came from the subsequent courses or subsequent books that this author published through the rest of his advisors who support his work. And I would recommend anybody who hasn't been trained specifically in business to go buy Rich Dad Poor Dad, and not only pick up Rich Dad Poor Dad, but go get Cash Flow Quadrant and all the rest of the books that I was reading the books on taxes, on business formation.
Yeah, it's funny. I've met Robert Kiyosaki and I've met Tom Wheelwright, who wrote the book on taxes, which I don't know if you read that book, but that book was kind of an eye opener.
No, I met
Tom's a good friend. Not a good friend. I mean, we got to know each other. He's interesting. We had him speak at one of our conferences, and you start to learn why the world works the way it does, right? What are the incentives that drive different things? And, why do you invest in an oil well, right? Or why do you invest in real estate like we do? So it's super eye opener. And it's just,
it's funny.
And I was a 25-year-old, probably not read both those books too. So
but that book too, that I would have said in my top 10 books, right? The other one for me would have been Think and Grow Rich. I think was just a great book. But man, Rich Dad, Poor Dad, Cash Flow Quadrant, it hit me at home. In fact, one of the presentations I do, I even have the cash flow quadrant showing people that, this is how you move. This is the I don't want to say easy. None of this is easy, right? Yeah. But it is a path to move you into that B quadrant quickly, right?
Right.
And I guess that's kind of what you saw too, because you went out and bought a $25 million company and then you bought a $33 million company behind it. So it's pretty impressive.
Well, let's dig into that. So you decided you want to go start buying a company, right? I mean, what were you targeting, right? Did your buy box change? Did you just get lucky with a quick hit up front, or were you kind of slogging it through, right? Some guys we talked to searched for years to finally find something. So what was that kind of roadmap?
That was me. I was the guy who searched for years. Yeah, after I read the books, it gave me the inspiration and the belief that this could actually work. it didn't give me the network. It didn't give me the contacts. It didn't give me the education as it relates specifically to business acquisitions. And at the time in 2015, when I was around 25, most of this stuff didn't exist. There wasn't an M&A Launchpad, podcast that existed. There really weren't any M&A podcasts that existed in 2015, other than things that were very specialized to the private equity world. And private equity, as a industry, is going after such larger acquisitions that while the principles remain the same, the actual work in practice is often difficult to apply at the local level. And so for me, the next step was, how do I learn what I can from not just from books, but from like credible people who I could trust. And ideally, I do that in person. And I had this idea that I had actually started to put in practice years ago, and I had learned this from Steve Jobs in an interview. In a commencement speech he gave to Stanford. He talked about how he used to sit in the back of classes after he dropped out of Reed College. And a lot of the things that he learned from sitting in the classes ended up becoming some of the foundational things that we use in our MacBooks. And from that idea, I realized, I guess I could just go find courses online that teach the subjects that I'm trying to learn, find out when those courses are being taught in person and go sit in those classes. And I lived in New York at the time, or I live in New York. And so I'm, Columbia is up the street from me, 5 minutes away. NYU's down the street. And then every other major or a lot of major colleges are, within either walking or driving distance from me. And so I learned that there was a professor who was going to be teaching entrepreneurship to acquisition, or teaching those MBA candidates how to buy companies at Columbia's business school. And I learned when that class was going to be taken, and coincidentally, I had just started learning about the subject, and maybe a week later was the day of the first class. And so when I realized that, I put it on my schedule, and then I showed up at Columbia Business School and sat in the back of the class.
There you go.
Weren't registered or anything. You just showed up, and you approached the professor, or did you try to just leave it to kind of fizzle by itself?
I just tried to stay as quiet as I could for as long as I could. Ultimately, the professor did identify that I wasn't a student in the class. And we ended up figuring out a way for me to, learn what I could from him, even though I wasn't a student. Ultimately, I've actually never told this story publicly. Ultimately, the professor said, "Hey, I can't let you sit in the class, but if you want to, I'll let you record the class." And so I would show up to class maybe 5 minutes ahead. I'd give him my cell phone, and he would let me press record. I'd leave the cell phone in the class for about 2 hours, and then I would go home and I would listen to the recording. And
that's conviction. That's awesome.
It's amazing.
Yeah. And, funny enough, that ended up being even better than sitting in the class, because now I had the recording, so I could go back and say, okay, I didn't understand what that was, and go listen to it, And then I had him as a resource because he's right there in person. So it's like having a YouTube class, except I could go and, at the end of the class, it wasn't like he was like, "No, I won't have a conversation with you." We ended up having great conversations. And then that became the way that I ended up becoming a lecturer at Columbia Business School, because maybe a year later he was calling and looking for other people to be guest lecturers who could talk about the experiences of people who buy companies or are trying to buy companies, and he would invite me back to be a speaker in a class. And so coming from that to now I'm speaking at an Ivy League school. And so Ivy League's business school, no less. And so that was the beginning of me trying to just build the actual foundation of education, particularly in a space where there was not, an existing foundation that I could. And
that's that's the difference between entrepreneurs and the people that go get W-2s, right? It's you slog it out, and you kind of get past all the conventional wisdom and the conventional things, and you don't have to go and be registered for school to go sit in a class. Yeah, you might get in trouble, or someone will catch you. It's suspicious whenever Bakari was just never showing up on test day. He just every time tests would, everyone had grown about the test. He just wouldn't care. But ultimately
This is
you're
a
out
true
there, you
statement.
have to have the self-conviction to go and drive yourself to grow to another level, right?
I do remember being in class at times when people would talk about, oh man, I really didn't like the assignment last week, or like the difficulty with this. And I'm like, I don't even have access to that.
Yeah.
So
That was
take us to the first acquisition, right? So it looks like, did you make your first acquisition in 2021?
That's right.
And this is a $25 million educational technology company, correct? So you didn't go small. You went right there, smack dab in the lower middle market.
So as I mentioned, I started this thing, back in 2020, back in 2015. And so from 2015, basically nonstop, I was exclusively focused on trying to buy a company. I did everything I could think of to make that more likely to happen. I created a group called the Alternative Investments Club, and I would host events in New York at Jay-Z Sports Club, at Jay-Z Sports Club in Midtown, and I hosted an event there every Tuesday for 4 years straight. And would invite entrepreneurs and investors to the club, something like 30, 40 investors in New York. And we would talk about deals, real estate deals, venture deals. And I would let people know that I'm interested in buying a company. And ideally, somebody would bring an opportunity to me. I was reaching out to brokers and investment bankers on basically a monthly basis, asking them for a deal flow. I was on Axial, the platform, and sourcing deals from there. I was having a meeting with an owner of a company probably once a week, making offers probably once a month, and from 2015, 2016, 2017, 2018, when I started this thing back in 2015, I thought this was going to be wrapped up by the time I was 28. Like I was like, yeah, 3 years at max, and if I get to 28, something went really wrong. It was a true grind. My first transaction that got really close was a healthcare transaction, buying a medical practice. Everything was set up to work, and then that deal fell apart right before we were supposed to close because the seller had stopped basically running the practice because he was aware that the transaction was going to go through over the course of our due diligence period. So 3 months of him not actually, seeing patients and doing what he was supposed to do. And basically the EBITDA on a TTM basis going backwards from the date we were supposed to close had collapsed by like 40% and was basically precipitated a drop in the price, and not only a drop in the price, but a drop in the confidence that all of my investors had in the business. Because if this guy could literally just stop for 3 months, maybe it's just not the right business for us to buy.
Right.
Tried to buy a label paper manufacturer, label paper manufacturer. Basically, if you go to like a supermarket to get like a sandwich or a soup from the prepared food section, you take it up.
You put the labels on.
Right. They put the label on it. This company created the printers that would sit inside the supermarket and then supplied the supermarkets with the label paper on an ongoing basis. Made around $10 million a year, about $2 million in annual profits. Had put together all of the capital financing for that transaction. And last month before we were supposed to close, the seller backed out of the letter of intent, just on his own without really any warning, and then ultimately sold the company to a competitor. These things happen. These like massive disappointments happen multiple times throughout this process. And so ultimately, by the time we got to the educational technology company, that success, I was basically at this place that I've mentioned before in other shows where people have asked me, what, how have you gotten successful? How have you been able to do this, da, da, da? And there's a rapper, his name is Nipsey Hussle, who I'm a big fan of personally and musically. And he once said, the only distinguishing quality between me and someone else who wants to do what I do is that I didn't give up.
Resilience. I
He's
was
like,
literally thinking about the title for this podcast, and that's kind of the story there.
he's like, I went through every emotion, heartbreak, elation. You going through every, the whole gauntlet, exuberance to humiliation, like the whole thing. But what I did, that was the lucky thing that I did was that I never gave up. And so when that deal fell apart, the label paper manufacturing deal, I had at that point basically had already started looking for a lease in the city that the company was in, because I was going to run that company full time as CEO. I had told most of the major people in my life that this transaction was going through, because at that point it was. And so when it fell apart, having now done, at that point, it had been 4 years of just nonstop focus on this one goal. I was heartbroken. Like, I was literally walking through the streets of New York, like, oh my God, I can't believe it. Like, I was like crying. Like, it was really devastating. And the one thing I constantly credit myself for doing, and if I could go backwards in time and see myself, I would just clap for for me doing this move, which is within a week of that deal falling apart, I pressed the green button on my computer and sent the blast email out to a bunch of different business owners in my radius that had a business of a size that I was interested in acquiring, and it tapped the shoulder of this. Or caught the attention of this person who owned this educational technology company, and he reached out back to me and said, "Hey, let's have a meeting." And
Nice.
that was my first closing. And so,
nice. So what tool was it that you were using to find the businesses kind of the size that you're looking for?
yeah, so there's a website called the SBSS, I think that's the name of it, which is basically a place where you can get all of the email addresses for government contractors, federal government contractors, and on this list, it has all of the relevant information, including email addresses, names, a summary of what the business does, an approximate sense for revenue and EBITDA. No, not EBITDA, just revenue. A column that tells you how many employees they have, where they're based, city name, city, state, address, the whole nine. And so,
wow.
And we'll check that out and put it in the show notes.
I don't think what I've just shared, that thing, and I'm pretty sure it still exists. I haven't been on the website in a while. I haven't seen a resource like that really anywhere. So your listeners are getting, and I remember the exact day when my friend Reggie, who actually used the same website and got his transaction completed, tapped me on the shoulder, and I had asked him, "Hey, how are you finding deals?" And he was like, "Hey, and he showed me this platform." And so it's a government site. You can download contact information directly from there. And so that's where I found to be clear, I also found a lot of duds. Like,
sure. But Bakari, before you jump, I just want to touch on this, because those listeners, you can give them a website, right? But what you can't give them is that 4 years to prepare you to be able to close the deal, right? There's so many people that we talk to that are like, "Hey, I'm searching. I've been at it for a year, and man, it's tough. It's hard." But then even though you're searching, when you get to the table with the seller, now you've got a new skill set you've got to learn, right? Which is the negotiation. And we went through this with Bill Snow, talking about from an investment banking standpoint, that the searching is the hardest part. Negotiation's the fun part. And then the financing is the easier part, right? It was a great point that he made. But to put you in a position at probably 29? You said you were 28?
I was 29 at that point.
At 29, you're now prepared to execute the deal and the transaction. That's the kind of stuff that all that tilling and all that studying, personal development, putting on those events. I mean, think about it. I mean, we're putting on the conference, we're putting on events, and we
have a meetup that we've done for 6 years, right? And you keep doing it, and you just don't know who's going to come through the door. And half of them aren't that successful, but it's really those 10% of them that you get some real value from them, but having the resilience to keep doing it. So.
I ran a funding post event. I don't know if you know Joe Rubin out of New York, but he ran a lot of the venture capital firms through a thing called Funding Post. And I reached out to him back after I had left one of my startups, and I went to start something else, but I didn't have an idea. So I went ahead and started the Funding Post in Houston. And man, I met the most amazing people having these events. So it's kind of amazing that tenacity to do it every Tuesday for 4 years. And I bet you the people that you met, you had your investors lined up from that. I mean, that's a beautiful thing. And then the whole time I just want to get my deal done. But you built all of the tools you needed to get there. Man, it's a phenomenal story.
Thank you.
So maybe walk us through it. So, seller reached out to you, said, hey, I'm looking to sell my business. What was the motivation on his side? How'd you guys structure the deal and how'd you get it done?
Sure. So on this deal, so the first thing to be aware of as it comes to me is my whole entire approach up until very recently was to buy a company and also to run it full-time as CEO. And so at that time, when I first came across this concept of trying to buy a company, the only model that I was aware of that I felt that I was appropriately positioned to take on was the search fund style acquisition, where you'd buy a company, pull together a group of investors to get the deal done, and they would ultimately help you run the company. You put together a small board and make it happen. I hadn't yet considered, even though I became aware of, but I had not yet considered the idea that I could operate as an independent sponsor, because frankly, I felt that the independent sponsors who I knew were these like really experienced private equity people who seemed like they had all this like experience and all that. Whereas the search fund folks were more like me, who had like, a smaller amount of experience, but seemed like they might be supported when they were in the actual operations chair. And so my conversation with the owner was about buying his company, and not just buying it, but also to run it as CEO. And so I think at the time he was looking at me as a succession opportunity that he didn't seem to have accessible to him from the people who he knew in his world. His children were very young at the time, in their early teens, interested in a business, but not ready to take on a CEO role for his company. And so these are the types of things that were exciting for him as we were chatting. And basically this was the summer of 2019. Basically from summer of 2019 until basically the beginning of 2020, we were negotiating and figuring out the financing structure for him and for me to get the deal done. Ultimately partnered with Iron Creek Partners, which is a family office that comes out of the search fund world, but also has an interest in the independent sponsor world, to complete that transaction. And then as we were in the middle of working to get this deal done, the most unexpected thing to ever hit the world.
It's 2020, so it ain't an educational tech company, right?
Comes right out of the wide blue and derails everything. And so now I'm in my 5th year trying to buy a company. And it seems like the actual universe is against me buying a business. Now the international pandemic has prevented me from getting this deal done. But ultimately, we ended up getting it back on track. The type of business it was actually a type of business that would benefit in some ways from the downturn in. So the company had a focus on workforce development. In 2019, one of the, sort of the fall of 2019, the number one thing that President Trump at the time was touting about his record coming into 2020, in his sense of what the election was going to look like, with the fact that unemployment was basically at zero, and there was almost no unemployment in the country at the time. And this company was a workforce development company focused on helping people who had recently lost their jobs. And so when I was out fundraising for it, a lot of investors were like, "What do we need a workforce development company? Are you not seeing the employment numbers out here? Everything is great. And within 5 months, those conversations, unemployment in the United States was like 50%. And so workforce development seemed to be a very, very critical, necessary thing. And so it became a bit easier to move that transaction down the line. And we ultimately ended up closing it in 2021.
So, and so the equity, sounds like the family office did the full equity stack, and then you guys figured out, essentially a carve out for you. And did you guys structure it more like a traditional search where you're getting some at closing, some at refi to kind of grow your equity position?
So on that transaction, there's some disclosure things that I have to be aware of as it relates to that. But sure, I can say it looked more like an independent sponsor deal than it did like a traditional search one.
Got it. Cool.
Makes sense.
Yeah, for those listeners, and we have a whole different episode about just the search world and how does a search model work. And it's funny, we've been to an event and we were specifically told, don't break the search model. Right? They don't want us to go outside the confines of how the search, process works and how do they structure it for kind of the searcher versus the money behind it. And so, for us, I mean, we're very flexible, dynamic people. So if you're a searcher out there, we'd love to talk to you. So I guess, maybe fast forward, I mean, burlap. What did you know about burlap before the company came your way?
I mean, I had seen potato bags and onion bags, those bags that they put on, the road when there's sand, like so sandbags kind of things. I had seen those, but beyond that, I was unaware of the business itself. And so when I first came across NYP Corp, I was not necessarily unenthusiastic about the company, but I wasn't clear. It took me a while to understand what was really, truly unique and magical about that business. And I honestly think the business opportunity that we're pursuing with NYP Corp is a very unique and one of a kind thing. And one of the things that's fantastic about it is that, it's an industry that most people would never even, look at twice. And the fact that it was an industry that people wouldn't like at times, one thing I can share about that transaction is that when I first came across that company, I was an employee at a private equity firm. And it was one of the first times I had worked for a private equity firm. And I had pursued that transaction on behalf of the private equity firm. And they had said that they didn't want to pursue it. They didn't like the industry. They felt like it had, it was too sleepy and this and the third, but they had a lot of things that they were anti the business. And I said, I want to pursue this and I'll leave the firm to focus on this transaction. Thinking at the time, this was 2021, actually. Thinking at the time.
You already had the education business at the time.
Knowing that the educational technology company was getting ready to close, I was thinking at the time that this one was going to take about 3 or 4 months. This was August of 2021. So I'm thinking this is going to wrap up, by at least New Year. Worst come to worst, we're talking, spring of 2022. And that one didn't close until January of 2023. So, yeah. And so these things always take much longer than anticipated. But it closed, and it's been a fantastic business so far. We have a fantastic CEO who we hired to run that company full time. Great partners with Granite Creek. And now, whereas I started this as a searcher, as a potential searcher, I've matured into the independent sponsor that I thought I wasn't qualified enough to be, but now have multiple transactions under the belt and are currently looking to close a new one. One that I started working on back in 2022, thinking this is going to all wrap up by, at worst, summer 2023. And we're on our way.
Stuff always drags. Question: who was running the education company for you, and what kind of gave you, the confidence to go look for another business essentially around the same time?
So we ended up keeping the existing CEO, who was CEO at the time when we bought the company, on as CEO. So he continues running the business today.
Got it. Okay. So both businesses you still have today?
So the educational technology company is still with Iron Creek, and NYP Corp is still owned by me and Granite Creek. And so everything's still active.
Still happy with both of them? Like kind of, now that you're on the back end of it, right? Because you go into transaction, you never really know what you're going to get or how it's going to work out. So having kind of essentially, a year, at least a year past even the second one. So far, so good. You're feeling good about kind of the prospects. And is it worked out like you expected, or just something, drastically different that you have to address pretty quickly early on?
So two things on that. The first is, I was starting from absolute zero, if not negative. And so anything that moved in my direction positively as it related towards closing a transaction, which was the only goal I had, was a good outcome. And so there's of course challenges and things that I'm happier or less happier with anything. But it is night and day, literally night and day, the difference between what my life was before I closed my transaction and after I closed it. You mentioned at the top of this call that I'm in Bali. I'm not just sitting in Bali. I'm in a 5-star resort in Bali, where I've been for a week, heading into 2 weeks. Most of my time here, I've been interacting with different celebrities who are also interested in this world of entrepreneurship through acquisition, and want to see how I can help them with buying companies that they're interested in buying. And so I've become like sort of an unofficial consultant for different folks out here who live in Bali. And when I leave, I'm going to leave Bali next week to fly to Hong Kong. Before I was in Hong Kong, I was in Manila. Before I was in Manila, I was in Vietnam. And before that, I was in Thailand. And each one of those was at about a month at a time. My life is literally night and day since, I was living in a little small studio apartment in Harlem, sneaking into classes at Columbia. Now the same class that I used to sneak into at Columbia, I teach at Cornell. And so there might be some student one day in the future who I'll look out into the crowd and be like, hey, I haven't seen that guy here before.
You never know.
Bakari, just an outstanding story, man. I tell you that's the beautiful thing about entrepreneurship, right? You're getting focused, you've got battle scars, wounds, and then you've got some beautiful story there to be there in Bali and just enjoying your world travels while you've got these companies working for you. That's the beautiful piece.
That's right. Before
we wrap up, you've given nuggets throughout this whole thing. So anyone that's listening probably got a wealth of your story. But if you wanted to leave entrepreneurs with maybe one thing besides your resilience and all that good stuff, what would you like to let them know? What would you like to tell them?
Yeah. So at the risk of you guys losing listeners, I would say, I think there are a lot of people who are interested in buying a company. And I meet them and I talk to them, and I'm sure you guys talk to them just as much as I hear from them as well. And it feels like they've read every book, they've listened to all the podcasts, they've gotten so much information. And then you ask them, what have you done today to buy a company? What have you done in the last week to buy a company? What was the last time you spoke to somebody who's selling a company? What was the last time you submitted a letter of intent? When was the last time you did anything actionable that lets you know that your life is different from last week or yesterday or last month as it relates to your goal of buying a company? And so I'd recommend anybody listening to this, continue listening to the podcast, but at the same time, know that listening to the podcast is a lot different than doing the things that we're talking about on the podcast. You should prioritize trying to make sure that you're making offers. And some people ask me what I would do if I could go back to, being 25, what advice I'd give myself. And I'd I would only wish I started faster. That's the only thing I could say to myself is I wish when I was 25 that I was 24 starting. And my whole idea here is I think this activity, this work that we're looking to accomplish together, this work of acquisitions is accessible. It's possible to be done. I've even shared with you guys, like I dropped out of college, like so I didn't even have like an undergraduate degree to get this stuff done. At different points in my life, I was homeless. Like I had a lot of like major challenges, and if somebody in my position can come full circle to being in this position, or not full circle, but 180 to be in this position, is completely accessible to somebody like you. And so that's what I would say to anyone listening to.
No, there's a ton of information out there, which is a good thing, and there's a ton of information out there, which is a bad thing, right? And you see it whether it's in the M&A space or the real estate space, that there's a lot of people that essentially have analysis paralysis, right? And they always want the perfect deal. And I tell people it's not about this. You never buy a perfect deal ever, right? It's about being comfortable enough, but knowing you're going to be uncomfortable, and have the wherewithal to work through the problems that identify themselves. So
get up off the couch, get off the podcast, and do right. Fail fast, move, go right.
Okay, Casey's really good at that one.
I am really good at failing. Trust me.
Let's go ahead and hop into the rocket round.
Sure. All right. So this is our round for the listeners where we ask Bakari some questions just to get to know him a little bit better here. So Bakari, what do you like to do in your free time?
My free time. Well, right now I am working on my first book, which is just be a memoir about, sort of going deeper into the experiences that I've shared here. So in my free time, I've been writing so far. And if I'm not writing, I'm probably listening to an audio book by some writer who wrote a good memoir and trying to get a better sense for how to write. This will be my first book. I'm excited to try to get it done. And that's probably what I'd.
Awesome. We'll have you back on when that book's ready to go. We're going to have you back on to promote it.
Let us know. All right. Next question. So in your entire business journey, what's been just kind of the most memorable moment that stuck out for you?
The most memorable moment as a business person was definitely when I got the call that confirmed that the educational technology company was going to close. That was the most transformational moment as a business person in my life.
Like finally turn that page.
Yeah. The only moment that I would say has just as much resonance for me is the first time I actually Googled the phrase leveraged buyout. I remember that day. I remember not knowing what a leveraged buyout is, not knowing anything about M&A. And like the moment in fact, at the time, I didn't even know the phrase leveraged buyout. What I Googled were these this acronym that I had seen a bunch of places, LBO. And then I Googled LBO, which is what introduced me to leveraged buyouts. And leveraged buyouts is what introduced me to search funds and ultimately what, set the career that I'm in today.
So that's amazing. All right, last question. What's your favorite tool or resource that you use? Could be for business or personal, but what do you like to use?
I would say YouTube is probably the most transformational tool that I've experienced throughout my entire life. There's very little in my life that I can't credit some piece of information I got from YouTube. In terms of a practical tool that someone listening could use, there are a few versions of these types of tools, but there are websites or apps that you can load into Chrome that let you go onto a LinkedIn page and extract an email address so that you're not sending when you want to reach out to somebody, you don't have to send them a LinkedIn message, which may or may not reach them, whereas you can get their email address and reach them directly. And that tool that I use, I believe is called Rocket Reach. But
No,
but
way
there's some.
early on in my career, my background software. And so I remember programming my own one from scratch back in 2012, right? Where I wrote my
Right.
whole thing, and it was like I had to set up the whole system to not only extract, but even do the messaging queue. And it was totally a
Nice.
hacky thing and working around, all the blocking from LinkedIn, but it worked and it was powerful.
Yeah,
But really quick, you mentioned
there was an
YouTube.
old one. There was an old one called Reportive that was it was so great because basically you would click on the LinkedIn page and it'll immediately populate it. Like you didn't even have to do an extra step. But now there's the steps of like clicking and all that. So it adds a little bit of a stress. But I just think having an email address is way more valuable than
I agree.
any other form of communication.
But I'm gonna put you on the spot. Name your two favorite YouTube channels that you think are just, man, these are just, having access to information is phenomenal.
Yeah. I'm not a particular subscriber to YouTube channels as much as I'm a click
Sure.
on the search bar and search for subjects.
How to or any of that. I'm the same way.
No, it's funny. I saw the difference. My generation was the Googlers, right? I got really, really good at Googling, and it was a skill, and that was my one up over everybody else. I could find whatever I needed immediately. And I noticed my younger brother, who's 15 years younger, was absolutely the YouTube generation. Like everything he would looking up, and he would go to YouTube and go watch a video on how to do it instead of me, I'd go search for a page to read how to do it, right? And so it's definitely interesting to see that shift.
Yeah, I would say sometimes some channels that stand out to me just because I know they stand out, and I'm sure they're not going to be any surprise to your audience, would be like Tim Ferriss's channel. Not to say that I listen to every single thing that he posts, but there have been some unique moments that have stood out to me. And Ramit Sethi's channel, I Will Teach You, which comes from his I Will Teach You to Be Rich book, which is probably the most important personal finance book that I've ever read, and set my entire sort of financial, like there was a version of me doing all the work, and I have friends like this, and this is probably a very underrated piece of the wealth building and also M&A world, which is I have friends who were also business successful, but had struggles with personal finance. And so the combination of this thing is to not only become wealthy and have a good business, but also to have a good personal wealth strategy, so that when you build all of this or create all this income and all this, it doesn't all disappear by poor management. And so
you're preaching. Yeah, you're preaching my language. I mean, we have a charity called Disrupt Gives, and we do basically rent forgiveness for people, but we require them to do the financial literacy, because you can forgive people's rent much as you want. But again, if they get themselves back in and to that same situation because they don't have the financial literacy needed, right? Well, you didn't really help. So I definitely know what you're talking about.
But you'd be surprised that, there's definitely the challenge of like the poor and lower class who struggle with personal finance. But you'd be surprised at how many extremely wealthy and successful business people have terrible personal finance strategies. And the crazy thing is, the only thing that's supporting the fact that the only thing that prevents them from chaos is the fact that they have a successful business.
Yeah.
But if anything happens to that business, they are truly they're wiped out.
And the first person that comes to mind is Allen Iverson. So for those listeners, go look him up and you kind of see the story, and it's just shocking, right? So
there's a lot of them. There's a lot of them. Hey, if you're making that kind of money and you're spending it all and it stops, man, that has got to be that's almost as bad as not having it at all.
Awesome.
So the Allen Iverson example is a great example of like somebody who was like working or paid or was highly paid. I'm saying separate from the highly paid people, I'm saying people who run businesses. Like they sell a product. They've done all of the stuff that we're doing. They bought a company, right? They did that, but they haven't solved the personal finance thing. They're terrible with their credit cards. They don't pay off things on time. They don't save. They don't invest in the stock market separate from their own company, a percentage of they're not doing all of the personal finance things. They just did a really good job on their business. And that's great, assuming that the business is going to be good forever. But it's not. All these things, there's always challenges to all sides of this thing. So I'd recommend, if anybody wants to also build wealth, but also sustain their wealth, to focus on personal finance. And I credit in a big way.
Yeah.
For putting me in a position to not only be successful as a business person, but also personally successful through.
Sounds like we have a great title for book number 2. So we'll expect those royalties. We'll figure that out with you later once you get that one written. So Bakari, thank you very much. Wealth of information, man.
Yeah, Bakari, great story. Thank you for being here.
Really quick, I know we talked about LinkedIn, but if people want to get a hold of you, how can they get a hold of you?
Yeah, so my website is graveshallcap.com. So,
and we'll put that in the show notes.
Feel free to get some information from like my journey and my approach to buying companies there. LinkedIn is always an easy place. I try to make sure to follow up. Email address is just my first name, Bakari@graveshallcap.com. While I've been traveling, living in a different country every month, I've been posting my journey and unique YouTube videos and vlog form, and making short videos that live on Instagram, and all of that is under the brand name Nomad Noir, Noir Noir, and so. But those are some places to keep up with me, and other places where if you reach out to me, and I'm open to helping and chatting with anybody. So feel free to reach out to me, and we can set up some time to chat.
Sounds good, Bakari. Awesome. Pleasure having your show. Thank you very much, man.
Yeah, thanks, Bakari.
Thank you very much.
All right.
Thank you for listening to the M&A Launchpad Podcast. If you've enjoyed today's podcast and would like to support us, please leave us a rating and a review after you listen. I'm Casey Minshew, and I look forward to talking with you next week.